On the night of July 29th, 2026, a drone came in low over the Egyptian port of Damietta and struck an American-owned gas tanker moored at the dock. Within minutes, fire had jumped to a second ship tied up alongside it. No sirens had warned anyone in the city that this was coming. No government had claimed the strike by morning. And for the first time since a war between the United States and Iran began 5 months earlier, the fighting had reached a country that had spent the entire conflict trying, carefully and deliberately, to stay out of it. That country was Egypt. That port was Damietta. And what happened there, and in the days immediately after, is the real story behind the headlines about something enormous supposedly returning to the Mediterranean. Before we get to what actually did, and did not, happen at sea over the past week, it's worth being straightforward about something. If you came here expecting a fresh account of a giant American aircraft carrier steaming back into the Mediterranean in the last day or two, the honest answer, checked against ship tracking data and the U.S. Navy's own fleet reporting as of this week, is that no carrier has done that. The last time a supercarrier entered those waters was months ago. What has actually happened is arguably more consequential because it isn't about one ship. It's about an entire new front in a war that was already reshaping the Middle East, and about a strike that Tehran seems to have intended as a show of strength, but that a growing number of security analysts now describe as a serious miscalculation. To understand why a drone hitting 2 tankers at a mid-sized Egyptian port matters this much, you have to go back to where this war started. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated series of strikes against Iran. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed in that opening wave, according to reporting that has been corroborated across multiple outlets in the months since. What followed was not a short, contained operation. It became a sprawling, months-long war that has touched nearly every country bordering the Persian Gulf, spilled into the Red Sea, and now, as of late July, into the eastern Mediterranean as well. In the opening days of the conflict, Iran fired ballistic missiles and drones at targets across the region. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps claimed strikes on U.S. military installations and on the carrier strike group built around the USS Abraham Lincoln. The United Arab Emirates alone has documented, according to its own defense ministry figures, more than 500 ballistic missiles, and over 2,000 drones fired at it since the war began, with the country's Patriot and Thayad batteries intercepting the overwhelming majority. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan, and Qatar have all reported strikes on their territory or on shipping near their coasts at various points since February. The war has not moved in a straight line. There have been at least 2 attempts at a ceasefire since it began. In April, President Trump announced a 2-week ceasefire tied to safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz, after warning Iran that its infrastructure could be targeted if it didn't comply. That arrangement did not hold for long. In mid-June, Washington and Tehran signed what became known as the June 17th Memorandum of Understanding, an agreement that was supposed to end fighting on all fronts, lift the U, S naval blockade on Iranian ports, and reopen the Strait of Hormuz to normal shipping traffic. That agreement collapsed too. By early July, Iran was accused of launching drone attacks against container ships in violation of the memorandum, and the United States reimposed its blockade against vessels transiting to or from Iranian ports on July 14th, according to tracking published by the advocacy group United Against Nuclear Iran. Iran, in turn, began attacking commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz starting July the 7th, and the fragile peace that had held for a few weeks broke down entirely. That is the backdrop against which the last 2 weeks of this war need to be understood, because the pace and geography of the fighting accelerated sharply in that window. On July 29th and 30th, Iran launched a wave of drone attacks against Kuwait, a 2-day sequence that, according to open-source military tracking published under the Iran War 2026 Daily Operations Report, prompted no formal Kuwaiti Ministry of Defense interception statement after the second wave, and was not extended into a third night. Hours before the strike at Damietta, joint U.S. and Saudi airstrikes on Iran-aligned militia positions in Iraq killed at least 20 fighters from the Popular Mobilization Forces and 4 members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, according to reporting that has been documented on the Wikipedia page tracking the 2026 Damietta drone strike and cross-referenced against wire coverage. The Iranian government launched what it described as a surprise ballistic missile attack against U.S. forces in Jordan around the same period, an attack CENTCOM said was fully intercepted, while Jordan's own military said it downed 5 missiles fired from Iranian territory. President Trump, responding to that strike, told Fox News the United States would hit back hard, saying in his words that Iran was going to get a beating. At the same time, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy said it had stopped 3 oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz for allegedly using what it called an unsafe route, without identifying the vessels involved or saying whether anyone was hurt. It's worth pausing on just how large the American naval commitment to this war has already been, because it explains why a claim about something massive returning to the Mediterranean would land as plausible in the first place, even if it isn't accurate this week. In February, the USS Gerald R. Ford, the world's largest aircraft carrier, was retasked from operations in U.S. Southern Command and sent through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean, joining the USS Abraham Lincoln, which was already operating in the Arabian Sea. At the height of the buildup that followed, U.S. officials confirmed to multiple outlets, including USNI News and Khaleej Times, that Washington had as many as 17 warships committed to the Middle East at once, including 2 full carrier strike groups operating simultaneously in the region, a configuration defense analysts described at the time as historically rare. The USS George H.W. Bush was added to that rotation in late March, departing Naval Station Norfolk after completing its Composite Training Unit exercise certification, specifically to relieve the Ford, which had been forced to briefly withdraw in March after a fire broke out in a laundry space aboard the ship, displacing roughly 600 sailors before repairs were completed at Suda Bay, Greece. By May 4th, with 314 days at sea and a broken post-Cold War deployment record behind it, the Ford transited the Suez Canal back into the Mediterranean one final time on its way home to Norfolk, handing off its role in the region entirely to the Bush and the Lincoln. That handoff is the last confirmed carrier movement through those waters, and it happened 3 months ago, not this week. It's against that fast-moving backdrop that the eastern Mediterranean entered the war for the first time. 3 days before the strike at Damietta, Iranian state television aired a broadcast with the headline, translated into English, "What could be the targets of Iran's revenge against Ukraine?" That broadcast, confirmed by multiple outlets including the Jerusalem Post and the Media Line, displayed a map of potential retaliation targets stretching well beyond the Middle East, and it specifically marked Damietta's liquefied natural gas facility, describing its annual production capacity of 5.2 million tons and calling it, in the broadcast's own language, a gateway for gas exports to Europe. The trigger for that threat was a Ukrainian drone strike carried out on July 25th against vessels in the Caspian Sea. Kyiv said it had targeted a Russian warship along with vessels carrying Iranian-linked military cargo. Iran said one of the ships hit was a civilian cargo vessel named Anna, and that an Iranian sailor had been killed in the strike. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, met with his Ukrainian counterpart just 2 days before the Damietta attack, and afterward said publicly that Iran, quote, does not seek escalation, but was demanding compensation from Kyiv for the sailor's death. That diplomatic exchange happened, according to Euronews and Ynet's reporting, on the Tuesday before the strike. The drone hit Damietta on Wednesday evening. What actually happened at the port itself is, by the standards of this war, relatively contained, at least in terms of casualties. A drone struck the Energos Winter, a floating storage and regasification unit flagged to the Marshall Islands, but owned and operated by the American company Energos Infrastructure. The fire that resulted spread to a second vessel moored alongside it, a Bermuda-flagged LNG tanker called the Gaslog Salem. According to Egypt's petroleum ministry, both crews were evacuated before the fire reached them, and no injuries or fatalities were reported on either ship. Firefighting and security teams brought the blaze under control, and by the following morning, both vessels had been moved offshore for damage assessment. According to Kepler, the energy analytics firm that tracks maritime traffic in real time, the maritime security firm Ambre told reporters that at least 2 drones appeared to have been used in the attack. Egypt's petroleum minister, Karim Badawi, personally traveled to Damietta to oversee the response, an indication of how seriously Cairo treated even a strike that materially damaged 2 ships without killing anyone. Here is where the story becomes genuinely interesting, and where the phrase backfired starts to earn its place in this script rather than functioning as a cheap headline hook. No group and no government has formally claimed responsibility for the Damietta strike. Not Iran, not any of Iran's regional proxy militias, not the Houthi movement in Yemen, which has openly denied targeting any vessel at Damietta, a denial reported by multiple outlets tracking the incident. That absence of a claim matters because it left a vacuum that different actors have filled in strikingly different ways, and those competing interpretations tell you almost everything you need to know about why this strike did not accomplish what Tehran likely wanted it to. President Trump, for his part, was blunt. He described the incident in Egypt as, in his words, Iran-related, but that characterization was immediately complicated by voices closer to the ground. Hani El Assar, executive director of Egypt's National Center for Studies and a researcher specializing in security and military affairs, told the Washington Times directly that he ruled out Iran itself as the executor of the operation, suggesting instead that a proxy or an entirely different actor may have carried it out. 2 Iranian officials, speaking anonymously to the New York Times, offered yet another version, telling the paper that the strike was intended as a warning, a demonstration that Tehran could inflict far greater disruption on global shipping and energy markets if the conflict widened further. Notably, those officials would not say whether Iran executed the strike directly or whether one of its regional partners carried it out on Tehran's behalf. When a government's own anonymous sources can't agree on who pulled the trigger, and a hostile government's own president is asserting responsibility that the country accused of it won't confirm or deny, you are looking at a strike that has generated confusion rather than the clear deterrent message an attacker typically wants. And that confusion extended to the strategic assessment of what the strike actually achieved. Eli Rettig, an assistant professor in the Department of Political Studies at Bar-Ilan University, who specializes in energy geopolitics, told the media line that the Damietta strike was, in his assessment, mainly symbolic. Brenda Schaffer, an energy expert affiliated with the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School, offered a different but related read, telling the same outlet that Tehran would likely select future targets, in her words, by opportunity rather than by calculated choice, and that energy and gas facilities worldwide needed to raise their security posture as a result. Schaffer specifically attributed the strike to Iran and framed it as an attempt to push global oil and LNG prices higher, timed to pressure the Trump administration ahead of the U.S. midterm elections in November. That is a meaningfully different read from El Asr's skepticism that Iran was directly responsible. And the disagreement between credible named analysts is itself worth flagging honestly rather than smoothing over for the sake of a cleaner narrative. What isn't in dispute is the operational and diplomatic fallout, and this is where the strike's backfire becomes clearest. First, the practical damage was limited and quickly reversed. Egyptian officials said Damietta resumed normal operations after only a brief partial shutdown overnight, according to reporting from outlets tracking the port's recovery. Second, and more importantly, the strike ended Egypt's exemption from this war rather than intimidating it into passivity. For 5 months, Cairo had managed to stay on the sidelines of a conflict raging on nearly every side of it, maintaining working relationships with both Washington and Tehran, even as the Suez Canal, through which roughly 12% of global trade normally passes, saw dramatic declines in traffic because of the broader regional instability. The Damietta strike ended that careful balancing act. Talat Taha, an Arab affairs specialist and editor at the Egyptian state-owned newspaper Al Gomhouria, put Egypt's likely response bluntly, telling the Washington Times that, quote, Egypt will not enter a war, but there may be painful strikes against the party that is implicated. That is not the reaction of a country that has been successfully deterred. That is the reaction of a country signaling it now considers itself a legitimate party to a conflict it had spent 5 months trying to avoid, and one that is now openly discussing retaliation of its own. Third, the strike accelerated exactly the kind of international pressure campaign Tehran has spent the war trying to blunt. On the very same day the Damietta strike occurred, the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control designated 2 firms at the heart of what OFAC described as an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps-backed extortion scheme, the Persian Gulf Marine Insurance Company and Hormuz Safe Marine Services Authority, which had been forcing commercial vessels to purchase mandatory insurance simply to transit the Strait of Hormuz. OFAC also sanctioned 8 additional vessels tied to Iran's so-called shadow fleet, used to move Iranian crude and petrochemical products around existing sanctions regimes. That timing wasn't a coincidence. It reflected a broader hardening of the international financial and diplomatic response to Iran's maritime campaign, a response the Damietta strike only reinforced rather than deterred. The maritime intelligence firm Windward, which tracks vessel movements globally, described the Damietta strike in its own analysis as opening what it called a third front, entirely separate from the existing Gulf and Red Sea theaters of the war, a characterization that underscores just how significant this was as an escalation, not a triumph, for Tehran. Fourth, and this is the piece that connects most directly back to the naval question this video opened with, the strike happened at almost the exact moment the war's overall trajectory was bending toward de-escalation rather than expansion. On August 1st, President Trump canceled what he described as a planned multi-day air campaign against Iran, one he characterized as potentially the largest American military operation since World War II, according to detailed daily tracking published by the open-source military analysis outlet Global Security. Org, Trump stated that Israel had joined him in that decision to stand down, posting that, in his words, "The country of Israel joins me in this commitment." In the days that followed, the geography of Iran's own attacks contracted noticeably. No new Israeli strikes on Iranian territory were reported. The drone campaign against Kuwait wasn't extended into a third consecutive night. Al Jazeera characterized the region as relatively calmer on August 2nd, with both sides pulling back from major new attacks, even as the maritime dimension of the conflict, including continued IRGC activity near the Strait of Hormuz, remained active. That relative calm has been messy and, frankly, contradictory over the past several days. And it's worth walking through exactly what has and hasn't been confirmed, because the diplomatic picture out of Washington and Tehran right now genuinely does not agree with itself. On August 3rd, President Trump said negotiations with Iran would resume that Monday afternoon. Hours later, Iran's foreign ministry spokesman, Esmail Baghaei, denied that any new negotiations with the United States had been requested or agreed to, telling reporters in comments reported by CNN and NBC News that Iran currently has no negotiations with America, and that the country had no plans to host foreign delegations or send its own negotiators abroad in the coming days. Trump responded by calling the Iranian leadership, in his words, unbelievably duplicitous. What Baghaei confirmed instead was a separate, narrower diplomatic track. Negotiations between Iran and Oman over a new temporary shipping route through the Strait of Hormuz, distinct from the broader question of whether the strait reopens to unrestricted traffic. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, said discussions with Muscat over managing that route were, in his words, in their final stages. By August 3rd and into August 4th, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told CNBC that a deal to open the Strait of Hormuz to what he called freedom of movement could be reached, in his words, today or tomorrow. Oil markets moved on that optimism. Brent crude fell roughly 4.5% on August 3rd, dropping to just over $83 a barrel, according to Bloomberg's market reporting, as traders priced in the possibility of reduced supply disruption. But optimism in the oil markets and confirmed on-the-record government commitments are two very different things, and this script isn't going to pretend they're the same. As of this recording, Iran's government has publicly and repeatedly denied that direct U.S Iran negotiations are underway, while the Trump administration has publicly and repeatedly insisted that they are. CENTCOM, meanwhile, says it is continuing to enforce its naval blockade against Iran, regardless of the diplomatic back and forth, and has redirected 44 commercial vessels attempting to transit the Strait of Hormuz since reimposing that blockade in mid-July, according to figures reported by Al Jazeera. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has said its forces remain ready for what it describes as any miscalculation by, quote, what Iranian officials called extra-regional enemies. None of that sounds like a war that has ended. It sounds like a war where both sides are simultaneously testing the waters for an off-ramp and keeping their weapons loaded in case that off-ramp doesn't materialize. So where does the American naval posture in the Mediterranean actually stand right now, and how does that square with a title suggesting something massive just arrived there again? According to the U.S. Naval Institute's own fleet and marine tracker, published August 3rd, the situation is more modest than the framing might suggest, and it's worth being precise about it rather than inflating it. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group is operating in the Arabian Sea in support of what the Navy calls Operation Epic Fury. The USS George H.W. Bush Carrier Strike Group is also operating in the Arabian Sea, not the Mediterranean. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the Navy's newest and largest supercarrier, transited home through the Mediterranean back in early May, ending a record-setting deployment of more than 300 days, and by all available tracking has not returned. What is currently in the Mediterranean are smaller, though still significant, surface combatants. The guided missile destroyers USS Roosevelt and USS Paul Ignatius, both homeported at Naval Station Rota in Spain, conducting independent operations in those waters, alongside a broader NATO and allied naval presence that has quietly expanded since the war began, including warships that France and the United Kingdom each committed to the eastern Mediterranean earlier this year as the conflict intensified. There is also a single U.S. destroyer, the USS Gonzales, operating separately in the Red Sea. That is a real and meaningful American and allied naval commitment to the region. It is not, as of this week, a supercarrier steaming back into the Mediterranean, and a script that told you otherwise would be trading accuracy for a cheap thrill. What is genuinely massive, and what deserves to be understood as the real headline here, is the geographic and strategic expansion this war has undergone in the space of about 10 days. A conflict that began in February as a series of strikes confined largely to Iranian and Israeli airspace has, by the end of July, spread to encompass drone attacks on Kuwait, missile attacks on U.S. forces in Jordan, continued assaults on shipping throughout the Strait of Hormuz, a Ukrainian strike deep into the Caspian Sea, and now, for the first time, a strike reaching Egyptian soil on the shores of the Mediterranean. Egypt's Suez Canal sits at the literal choke point connecting the Red Sea theater of this war to the Mediterranean theater, and Damietta itself sits only about 33 miles west of that canal's northern entrance, according to geographic analysis published by the War Zone. That geography is precisely why the strike matters so much more than its modest material damage would suggest. It demonstrated that Iran, or an actor operating in Iran's name, is either willing or believed to be willing to strike facilities in a country that had scrupulously avoided taking sides, located on a body of water that had, until July 29th, remained entirely outside this war's 5-month footprint. It also helps to understand what else was happening across the wider region in that same window, because Damietta didn't occur in isolation, and treating it as an isolated event would misrepresent how this war has actually been fought over the past several weeks. The Houthi movement in Yemen, operating separately from Iran's own forces but broadly aligned with Tehran, has maintained a declared blockade on Saudi-linked shipping through the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, a choke point at the southern end of the Red Sea, and has continued striking or turning back Saudi-flagged vessels attempting to pass through it. 6 Saudi-operated tankers were reported to have diverted entirely around the African continent in early August, according to ship tracking data cited by CNN, adding at least 2 weeks to their journeys simply to avoid that blockade. At the same time, a Chinese-flagged bulk carrier completed a full transit from China to the Saudi port of Jeddah through that same strait during the active blockade, which Windward's maritime analysts flagged as confirmation that a separate, quieter arrangement allowing safe passage for Chinese-flagged vessels appears to be functioning in practice, even as Western and Saudi-linked shipping remains at risk. Iran's own naval forces, meanwhile, have continued operating a large fleet of so-called dark vessels, ships that deliberately switch off their tracking transponders, clustering near Larak Island inside the Persian Gulf. Windward's tracking found that cluster grew from 14 to 18 vessels in the days immediately surrounding the Damietta strike, with 17 of those 18 ships showing no active tracking signal at all, a pattern consistent with sanctions evasion rather than legitimate commercial shipping. That is the environment the Damietta strike landed in, a war already being fought through blockades, sanctions evasion, proxy deniability, and dark shipping fleets, layered on top of conventional missile and drone exchanges. Adding a new front in the Mediterranean didn't happen because Iran had run out of other options. It happened based on the timeline multiple outlets have now independently confirmed, specifically as retaliation tied to a single incident in the Caspian Sea involving Ukraine, a country with no direct role in the broader U.S. Iran conflict at all. That detail matters because it means the strike that opened this new Mediterranean front wasn't really about the war with Washington or Israel in the first place. It was a spillover from an entirely separate grievance, redirected at a target, Egypt's LNG infrastructure, chosen because it served European gas markets rather than because it had any direct connection to the dispute that supposedly justified striking it. When a retaliatory strike widens a war for reasons that don't even relate to that war's primary combatants, the case that it represents a strategic misstep rather than a calculated success gets stronger rather than weaker. And that brings us back to why so many analysts are using the word backfired to describe what Iran, or whoever carried out the Damietta strike, actually accomplished. If the goal was deterrence, to demonstrate to Ukraine, to Europe, and to the broader coalition arrayed against Tehran that continued pressure would carry serious costs, the response has been the opposite of deterred. Egypt, previously a careful neutral party, is now openly discussing retaliatory strikes against whoever is found responsible. The United States Treasury moved the same day to tighten financial sanctions on the exact maritime insurance and shadow fleet infrastructure Iran depends on to keep exporting oil under sanctions. Energy security experts worldwide, per Brenda Schaffer's own assessment, are being told to raise their alert posture, which functionally means increased security spending and increased vigilance around exactly the kind of infrastructure Iran might have hoped to hold, at risk more cheaply through fear alone. And the broader diplomatic trajectory of the war, rather than being frozen by the threat of a widening Mediterranean front, appears to have continued moving, however messily and inconsistently, toward the kind of negotiated framework that would end Iran's ability to use exactly this sort of asymmetric pressure indefinitely. If Tehran wanted to demonstrate strength and reach, it succeeded at the reach part. Whether it succeeded at anything else remains, based on the actual public record as of this week, genuinely unproven, and several credible regional analysts now doubt it did. It's also worth pausing on what this episode says about the difficulty of covering a war like this one responsibly. No party has claimed the Damietta strike. The country accused of it hasn't confirmed involvement. 2 of its own officials gave anonymous, incomplete answers to a major American newspaper. A respected Egyptian security researcher publicly doubts Iran carried it out directly at all. And the sitting president of the United States has stated a firm conclusion that it was, quote, Iran-related, that the available public reporting simply does not yet corroborate with hard attributed evidence. That's not a criticism of any one source. It's a reflection of how information moves and doesn't move during an active multi-front war involving state actors, proxy forces, and a genuine information vacuum where no one involved has an incentive to speak clearly. This script has tried to hold that ambiguity honestly rather than resolve it artificially in either direction, because pretending certainty exists where it doesn't is exactly the kind of shortcut that erodes trust in reporting on conflicts like this one. If there's a through line connecting the Damietta strike, The collapsed diplomacy of the June memorandum, the reimposed blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, and the confusing, contradictory statements coming out of Washington and Tehran this week, it's this. 5 months into this war, both sides appear to be searching for an exit that neither wants to be seen requesting first. Iran denies negotiating directly with the United States, while simultaneously negotiating a parallel shipping arrangement with Oman that would functionally ease the pressure both a U.S. blockade and Iran's own restrictions have placed on global shipping. The United States insists talks are actively underway while threatening, as recently as August 1st, an unprecedented new wave of strikes if they aren't. And in the gap between those two positions, at a port most people outside the shipping and energy industries had never heard of before last week, a drone strike that nobody has officially claimed managed to widen a war that both sides increasingly seem to want to end without meaningfully advancing whatever goal it was actually meant to achieve. That is, by any reasonable definition, a strike that backfired, even if we may never get a fully attributed on the record account of exactly who launched it. Before wrapping up, it's worth being transparent about where the reporting stands and where real uncertainty remains, because that's part of doing this honestly rather than just entertainingly. The core, verified facts are these. A drone strike did hit the Energos Winter and gas log Salem at Damietta on July 29th, confirmed by Egypt's own petroleum ministry and multiple independent maritime trackers, including Kepler and Ambri. Iranian state television did name Damietta as a potential retaliation target days earlier, tied explicitly to the Caspian Sea strike on the vessel Anna. The Trump administration did cancel a threatened large-scale air campaign against Iran on August 1st. The Treasury Department did sanction Iran-linked maritime insurance and shadow fleet entities the same day as the Damietta strike. What remains genuinely unverified, and what this script has deliberately avoided stating as settled fact, is who specifically executed the Damietta strike, whether it was Iran's own forces or a proxy acting in Iran's name or interest, and whether the diplomatic talks President Trump describes as active are, in fact, occurring in the form and substance he's described, given Iran's public and repeated denials. Sourcing for this account draws on Reuters and Bloomberg Market and diplomatic reporting, CNN and Al Jazeera's live conflict coverage, the New York Times' anonymous Iranian official sourcing, the Washington Times' interviews with Egyptian analysts, the Media Line and Jerusalem Post's expert commentary from Bar Ilan University and the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School, Euronews and Ynet's on-the-ground Egyptian reporting, the U.S. Naval Institute's fleet tracking, and maritime intelligence assessments published by Windward and the War Zone, where those sources disagreed on questions like direct Iranian responsibility or the true state of U.S. Iran negotiations. That disagreement has been presented rather than papered over. So here's the honest question this leaves us with, and it's one worth sitting with rather than rushing past. If a strike that generated confusion, drew fresh sanctions, ended a neutral country's exemption from the war, and coincided with a wave of positive-sounding but unconfirmed diplomacy, still gets described by multiple regional experts as a strategic backfire for whoever launched it, what does that tell us about how much control any single actor actually has left over how this war ends? Is Iran running out of moves that carry real deterrent value, forced into strikes that generate headlines without generating leverage? Or is this exactly the kind of slow, grinding pressure campaign that eventually produces exactly the sanctions relief and negotiated framework Tehran has been positioning for all along, with Damietta simply one more card played along the way? Reasonable, informed people, looking at the same set of facts, are reaching different conclusions, and that's worth thinking through for yourself rather than taking anyone's word for it, including this one. What do you make of it? That's where this one stands for now, with a war that keeps expanding geographically, even as both sides keep insisting, publicly and repeatedly, that they're closer to ending it than they've ever been.